I'm joined today by Kwadwo Sarkodie, who is a partner in our construction disputes and international arbitration practice here at Mayer Brown in London. Kwadwo, I know you've got lots of experience in working in sub-Saharan Africa and various disputes there, as well as internationally generally. And I just wanted to kick off with a very broad question, and I do appreciate you're not an economist, but what's your overview of the economic situation currently in Africa?
Thank you very much, Amy. Now, before I launch into the answer, I'd like to give a bit of a caveat, which I think will apply to quite a lot of what I say to you today, and that is it is hard to generalise because we are talking about a collection of over 50 countries. But that said, I think there are a couple of trends we can identify economically, certainly that have made themselves apparent over recent years and months. The first is, I think, something that will be reflected all over the world, and that is the effect of issues such as food insecurity, rising interest rates, climate change and so on. They're making their effects particularly felt in Africa. But also, on the other side, there is the potential. Africa's growth rates, although they have dipped, are still high by global standards, and there are sound factors underlying that growth. In particular, there's the great degree of natural resources which the continent, of course, holds, but also the fact that the continent will hold the world's largest working population by 2040.
And we know there's lots of activity and opportunity in the region. Have you seen an uptick in investments being made there?
There's definitely been an uptick over recent years. Now, to a degree, I think that is a bounce back really from the pandemic, which saw investments dip quite dramatically, but they are certainly back up. There's been a very substantial recovery which we've seen recently, and so the general trend of increase has certainly been resumed.
And are there particular sectors where you're seeing the majority of investment being made?
Well, a particular couple of sectors which are exciting for me really touch on the global energy revolution and developments there. So looking at clean energy, for instance, we're seeing a number of very significant wind power and solar power generation projects going on, being implemented around Africa on a very large scale. And equally importantly, smaller scale projects are also taking place. So, for instance, solar microgrids and so on. The need for energy is crucially important for the continent and is a crucial part of its route through to development. So that's particularly exciting. Also related to that are developments in the mining space. We've seen in particular the increased exploitation of some of the crucial minerals required for the energy transition. And I'm thinking here with regard to, for instance, lithium required for battery manufacture and development of the electric vehicle industry.
So what's on the horizon that might impact clients who are active in the region?
Well, one particular trend for me is the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Now, while this was signed back in 2018, or at least signature by states commenced at that point, what we've seen over the years since is an increasing number of African states signing up to that, to the point now where in fact, all states on the continent of Africa, save for one, Eritrea, have signed up. What that agreement seeks to do is create what is essentially the world's largest free trade area. It targets areas such as reducing tariff barriers, increasing harmonisation and simplification around the regulatory landscape and so on. So really the implementation of these sort of changes would have been brought about by the ability of the continent finally to achieve agreement across such a ambitious and dramatic free trade agreement are really driving interesting changes for our clients. Because what I think this will do is, as well as boosting the economy in Africa itself, it will also provide for a more predictable and readily understandable regulatory framework for those outside the continent who are investing, and also make it easier to operate across multiple African countries at the same time.
And I know you've done lots of projects in the region. Are there any particular nuances that people should be aware of and looking out for?
Absolutely. I think an important one to start with is the importance of investing in sound and solid personal relationships with the counterparty wherever that investment is being made. I spoke about the Continental Free Trade Agreement and its aims in reducing regulatory challenges and so on, because that is a particular area of challenge where particular obstacles lie. And the ability to navigate around those can be challenging, can be time consuming, and the two factors to really mitigate against that are, first, as I mentioned, solid relationships with local partners. Also, of course, the advice and support of advisors who really have deep-seated experience and knowledge in the particular region and dealing with those particular issues on a regular basis.
And are you seeing any trends in the type of disputes that are occurring?
Yes, we are, and really that brings me back to some of the points I made in response to your first answer. I think the increases globally of interest rates and so on are having a serious and often detrimental effect in many African countries. We're seeing government-run and sponsored projects or projects involving government-related entities come under pressure because availability of and cost of borrowed funds and pressure on local currencies, etc., are making commitments harder to sustain. All of that leads to the potential for either a need for renegotiation of terms, or when that's not possible or that might impact the overall viability, to disputes. So that they are trends which we're seeing, which are creating the conditions and pressure, I think, for a higher risk of disputes, coupled to, I think, and with the related fact, I think under that sort of pressure, governments are more likely to consider changing policy, so altering conditions with regard to tariffs, capital repatriation, and so on. All of those, again, feed through to an investor where the viability of the investment might be impacted and the dispute might become more likely.
And what role does international arbitration play in African disputes?
Well, thanks. Well, that's absolutely crucial. We see our clients going into Africa prioritising that as a means for dispute resolution. And that's really for a number of factors. The first is, I think, and most importantly, is neutrality. So where the alternative is going through the courts in the jurisdiction where the investment is being made, I think often investors will have concerns that they're not going to be being heard by an entirely neutral venue. Similarly, courts face challenges with regard to backlogs and the time that cases take to move through. And what, of course, arbitration offers is the ability for the parties to select their tribunal, to select their governing rules, to select a venue and a seat for their arbitration at a place of those choice, which can be neutral to either party, so not the state where the investment is being made, nor the state where the investor originates. So, we would certainly always advise the importance of providing sound and carefully thought through international arbitration provisions, and for many of our clients, that's a key part of protecting their investment.
So how else might investors look to act in order to protect their investments?
Well, I think importantly, supplementing the commercial arbitration provisions and protections, which I was discussing in my previous answer, a further consideration very often are the protections offered by way of bilateral or multilateral investment treaties. What these treaties provide is a commitment by the host state, i.e. the state where the investment is being made, to uphold certain standards and protections which are stated in the treaty for investors from the other state which has signed the treaty. Now, investment treaties are very prevalent in Africa, and indeed there are over 500 bilateral and multilateral investment treaties around the world which have an African signatory. This therefore means that there is actually plentiful resource, provided that the investment is structured correctly, is compliant with the terms of the particular treaty in question, for that to provide an additional layer of protection for the investor, particularly in the sort of instances I was describing earlier, where perhaps policy changes implemented by a government, perhaps in response to unforeseen economic developments and so on, change the terms of the investment to the detriment of the investor. It allows the investor the prospect of seeking effective recourse.
And have there been any recent developments in the sort of African dispute resolution landscape in the wider sense?
Sure. Well, drawing together some of the things we looked at with the Continental Free Trade Agreement and what I was discussing about investor protection, one of the key debates when that treaty was being put together would be how that would actually act to protect investments. One of the questions was whether within the framework put in place by the agreement, it would allow for African investors into other African countries to bring claims under a mechanism which would allow recourse directly against the government of the host state where they made the investment. Now, the ultimate decision, and as reflected in the agreement as finally executed, was not to provide that, and instead simply provide for state-to-state recourse. So I think that then puts back the emphasis on the importance of the bilateral investment treaty network, which already exists in place, which I discussed in the former answer. And in relation to that, there's been a further recent interesting development, and that's been the publication of a model form bilateral investment treaty for Africa. Now, this was developed by a group called the African Arbitration Academy, and what this sought to do was to balance the considerations around protection of investors, which you will normally see across investment treaties around the world, but also include provisions for other important considerations, such as maintaining regulatory freedom with regard to sustainable development, with the protection of indigenous rights, promotion of diversity, and so on. So other considerations which were considered important in the African context. And it is thought that going forward, that offers an important pattern which I think can be reflected in African investment treaties as they're signed up to going forward.
Thank you so much, Kwadwo, for talking to me today. That's really, really interesting. Final question before you go. What would be your key takeaways for our clients who are watching today?
Thank you so much, Amy. Well, for me, I think the key takeaways would always have to include, firstly, the importance that I mentioned of developing and investing in deep local relationships, which in turn I think gives the access to a proper and sound understanding of the local nuances, regulatory hurdles, and so on, which are important to giving rise to an effective investment. Second is the importance of international arbitration. As I was saying, it really is crucial to structuring a sound protection to manage and resolve effectively disputes which might arise. And finally, what I'd just like to re-emphasise is the scale and the extent of the massive opportunity which exists across this vast, diverse and richly endowed continent. Thank you.